Muy bien, yo creo que ya estamos
Well, I
preparados.
think we're all ready to
Lo
start.
primero,
First of all,
bienvenidos a todos
welcome
aquí. Es un
everyone
placer teneros
to this
aquí
session. It's a
en
pleasure to
este
have you all
auditorio
here
que la
in
verdad que está
this
muy agradable.
auditorium, which is
La
pretty
gente que ha
nice
estado trabajando
here.
de mi
All the
casa,
people
del
who
Foro
have been
Nuclear,
working here
la
from
verdad ha
Foro
aceptado que no se
Nuclear,
lo crean demasiado, pero yo creo que estamos
they
en un
were
sitio que
right
es
in
agradable,
choosing
tenemos
this
una buena
place.
luz
It's a
natural,
very
el cielo
nice
nos
place.
acompaña, buen
There's a
tiempo,
natural
Madrid,
daylight
España,
coming in. The
maravilloso.
weather is very nice here in
Y,
Madrid and Spain, and
y tenemos el gran honor,
we have the
el gran
great
honor de
honor
tenerle a Telma aquí.
of
Ahora os
having
contaré un
Telma
poco,
here
pero en fin,
today
tenemos el
with
gran
us.
honor
It's a
que
great
no
honor
nos
for
conocíamos
us.
personalmente,
We hadn't met
pero
before
muy poco
in
tiempo
person,
hemos
but
podido
in a very
en fin,
short
intercambiar palabras,
time we have
en
been
fin,
able to
sentimientos de
exchange
todo,
and
y
talk
la verdad
about
es que
feelings,
yo creo
about
que le prefiero
everything,
más
and
como
I
persona
could say that
que
I like her
institucionalmente.
better
Yo creo
as a
que
person
incluso es
than
mejor. Con lo cual
in
yo creo que
her
disfrutaréis un
institutional
montón,
role. So I think that you will
durante esta
enjoy
mañana,
her
¿no?
presentation and her presence here today.
Sabéis que nosotros en el Foro Nuclear
As you
pues,
know, in the Foro
organizamos
Nuclear, we
actividades,
organize activities,
actividades de vez en cuando de este tipo, os
sometimes this
invitamos
type of
a que vengáis,
activities, and we invite you to join
porque
us
nosotros estamos
because
convencidos
we
de
are
que
certain
somos
that
uno,
we
ponemos nuestro granito de arena, somos uno
are
de los
doing our
contribuyentes y
contribution
creemos en que hay que luchar con todo el tema
in
del cambio
order
climático.
to fight climate change.
Yo creo que ya es una cosa
I think this
que,
is something
que
that,
como idea,
as an
ya ha
idea,
calado. Yo creo que
has
ya,
already
no solamente las
been
instituciones,
installed
los
among the
partidos
institutions and the
las
political
empresas, sino
parties,
el
the
ciudadano
different
medio,
companies,
yo
but
creo
even
que
the
ya
average
está
citizen is
concienciado
already
del
aware
tema del cambio
of
climático. Otra
the
cosa
climate
son las
change
acciones
issue.
luego ya.
On
Hasta qué
there's
punto
the
la
part
gente
of the
está
actions on the
dispuesta,
other
por un
side,
lado,
and to what
a hacer
extent people
ciertos
are ready
sacrificios,
to
etcétera, porque el
do
tema
certain
del cambio
sacrifices,
climático
because
es un
climate
tema
change is
fundamentalmente,
a
yo diría,
topic
cultural.
that
Yo
has to
creo
do
que,
with cultural
incluso tenemos
aspects.
que tener un cambio de cultura, ¿no?
We need to have a cultural
El foro, como
transformation even.
sabéis,
The forum, as you know,
prácticamente todas las empresas
encompasses almost all
en el caso
companies
español, el foro nuclear,
in
casi todas las
Spain,
empresas que
all
trabajan
companies
en el
that
ámbito
are
nuclear,
working in the nuclear sector, nuclear energy sector.
ya digo, nosotros somos un contribuyente nato
are natural contributors to
a la lucha contra el
the
cambio
fight
climático.
against climate
Yo no
change.
quería alargarme mucho más.
I didn't
Quería
want to
simplemente
take
que
more
conocierais a
of your
Telma,
time. I
que,
just
como
wanted
digo,
to
es una
introduce
persona
Telma.
maravillosa,
Telma is a wonderful woman.
y os contará
And
cosas
she will be
no
telling
solamente
you
muy importantes y al mismo
very
tiempo
important things that are also very
lo cual
entertaining
es
and
muy
very
importante.
interesting. And this is
Telma,
very
o sea,
important.
tú
Telma,
vienes aquí con
you're
las
coming
siglas
here
IPCC.
under the
La
Ipcc
gente,
acronym,
lo del
and
IPCC
people
lo conoce, ha oído hablar
knows
del
a
IPCC,
little
pero
bit
¿qué
about
es
the
realmente
IPCC,
o qué
but could
hacéis,
you
cómo os
explain
agrupáis,
us
cómo estáis organizados?
how do you work, how you're grouped?
Perdonad un momento,
Oh,
Telma,
forgive me for the
su
second.
idioma
Telma, her
nativo
mother tongue
es
is
el portugués brasileño,
Brazilian
pero habla
Portuguese,
español
but
maravillosamente.
she
Luego
speaks
hablará en inglés,
Spanish
porque
wonderfully,
todos
and
los que hemos
later she
trabajado,
will be
a
speaking
mí me
in
pasa muchas
English,
veces, yo he estado fuera de España
because
durante
for
muchos años
those of us
y
who have
hablábamos en
worked
inglés todo el tiempo, y
abroad,
luego cuando venía a España y quería hablar
we
algo,
know
sobre
that
todo
we
en los
tend to
temas
speak in
técnicos
English,
en
and when
español,
we came back to
muchas veces no
Spain,
me salía,
especially
¿no?
when we
Porque
have
como
to
estás
deal
acostumbrado,
with
¿no?
technical
Hablar
topics,
en inglés, hay
we
muchas
find it
palabras,
hard
entonces
because it's
luego
we're
hablaré
so
en inglés,
used
pero
to
ahora
dealing
con
with
tu
these
maravilloso
topics in
español que
English.
tienes, cuéntanos un poco, a ver.
But now, please use your wonderful Spanish now to tell us, to introduce yourself. Good morning. I feel very much at home here. When I go to any place, I always need to feel the energy. And this is a very interesting place, a very warm place. And this makes a big difference in the way we communicate. So thank you so much, Ignacio, for allowing me to be here today. You know that as the president of the Ipcc says, we are communicating what we have about global science. Please forgive my Spanish. I will be speaking in English later. Ipcc was born 30 years ago. And this is the first time where we are having women in the chair positions. This is a very important step forward. The presence of women is more remarkable now. And it's not because they're there, it's the aspect that they are complementary. In the teams where we're used to having men and women, the work becomes even more interesting. It's very interesting to see right now how women bring their children, their babies to the meetings, and when they're really young, or they bring along their husbands so that they can take care of the children. So this is a change, and we see that there's a change in the attitude, in the way that women are having greater opportunities, and not because they're women. So when we talk about change, I think change is possible. Social transformation are interesting and possible. So Ipcc is made of 195 governments, almost all governments around the world. And this is where this was created under the auspice of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and since the beginning, the Ipcc is in charge of validating, of appraising all the global sciences related to climate change. So there are three groups. The physical basis for climate change, we're going to see this in depth later. There's a second group dealing with impact and vulnerabilities. And the third part, which is more politically close to the government decisions, which has to do with the mitigation of climate change, what we can do about it. So we have the issues, the impacts, and also what can be done about those. So these three groups are very important. And also we have another group dealing with the stock taking of the greenhouse gas emissions, and they develop different methodologies that all countries under the Climate Convention need to apply, making a difference between the developed countries and the developing countries, although this will be balanced under the Paris agreements. So we develop all these methodologies that need to be applied with certain flexibility. Well, you have taken a very important step forward, because since now there's a methodology, a shared methodology, it's very important, because otherwise the reliability and the possibility of comparing the data is being enabled. So there's a big difference between the stock taking in the developing countries and the developed countries. There's a lack of data in the developing countries, and this problem, we still see it. So they need more support, they need more enabling, and also we need to acquire more data so that developing countries can also have a good stock taking, because the Paris Agreement tries to take us to certain paths that lead to mitigate the global warming in 1.5 degrees Celsius. So how can we tell if we're in the right path? So with the stock taking, the stocks will be one of the tools that we will use to know if our efforts to diminish the emissions in each country are being fruitful. Allow me to make a little parenthesis here, open a little parenthesis here before you go into detail. How did you get there? Your responsibility right now is enormous. You have an incredible visibility. Your position is amazing. How did you get there? Because you have always worked in Brazil. You have held very important positions as well. So what has been your trajectory to get there? Tell me about your life. Well, my life is an interesting life, but I won't tell you everything. There are many successes and failures. Well, there have been many professional successes and many personal failures as well. Well, if I had to do things all over again, I would probably pay more attention to my personal life and to the family. There's always a balance that you need to achieve. I started in 2002. I started as an area director in an engineering field. Then I had a role in the National Research Institute in Brazil, where I've been working as a researcher for over 32 years. And I was the first woman who had the opportunity of having a chairing role, a directing role. I was also working I was part of the National Secretariat for Climate Change, and then I had a simple role as a director of this department for the development of policies for fighting deforestation in Brazil. So this is sort of a bridge between the scientific aspects and you have the Amazon area in your mind. Well, we're also dealing with El Cerrado, which is as important or even more so than the Amazon area. And the pressures for deforestation are very different from those in the Amazon area. So if you look into the production of bioenergy, the Amazon area is more directed at livestock and sometimes for crop and agriculture, but there's very little production for bioenergy because the circumstances don't allow it. So there are different pressures in each part of Brazil. So let me close this parenthesis about your personal life, and please proceed. One thing that I was recently asked was what were the recommendations from the Ipcc, and the Ipcc does not do any recommendations because governments have they don't tell governments what to do. The Ipcc just validates all the different data that are published internationally, and they also assess to what extent they match, and this allows the Ipcc to diminish the uncertainty. There's what we do. There are 3 vice presidents in the Ipcc, 2 of which are women, and we need to see if there's any bias. And as governments, as I will show you in a minute, governments also have the opportunity of seeing the drafts and the minutes of the reports and give their opinions. I think, and they give us our opinion about the prescriptions that they read, and there's a very thin line between prescribing something and just stating science data. For instance, one of the areas that are very interesting deals with the human changes, human behavior changes, even with the type of diets that we're having. So when you say that maybe you should have a certain diet that has a lower carbon content, then you can read somewhere that this means that we need to eat less beef because this has certain implications in the methane production, and this has implications also for certain countries that have an economy based in livestock production, and there are many different situations between the developing and the developed countries. So the Ipcc needs to be relevant but never prescriptive. And so this is why we don't say you should never use nuclear power, for instance. We would never say that. We would say science says this about the nuclear power, and then we will tell you about what the science says about this. And this is very interesting. And we're talking about the limit of reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature increase up to the end of the century. So we need to have models and hypotheses that make assumptions, about the way technology will be evolving, how humanity and the economy will evolve. So there are so many variables, and this is why we have so many different models. And we will see when we're talking about 1.5 degrees Celsius, what's the consideration about nuclear power? Me, as a nuclear power person, I like to hear you say that. I think it's quite impressive, and I think that's what we're missing to understand the sensibility, of the small temperature changes in the whole of the environment. We're talking about 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius, less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we might be tempted to think that this is not so important, but it is important. It is very important indeed. 1.5 that we had before the Paris Agreement. We had the goal of 2 degrees Celsius, but in Paris we were already talking about lowering this figure. When they talk about well below 2 degrees, what does it mean exactly? So you see politicians who are quoting the Ipcc statements, and many people wonder what did they mean by this. But the little islands put a lot of pressure in this because they were already reaching a 1.5 increase in temperature, and they're being threatened by this. And this affects also migration in other countries. And we are working with, we're dealing with a sovereignty problem, and this is crucial that we have this idea, this global idea of the world, and less individual idea of the world, and this change is what we are aiming for with a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And this is even a humanitarian challenge. It's an incumbent challenge, but it's also really interesting. It is, and if we see at the speed at which the renewable power sources are evolving, there was great dissemination of these renewable sources, and even if years ago we said this was not possible and this cannot happen quickly, but indeed it is possible. There are certain areas that are different, and the nuclear power is slightly different because of the upfront costs and also our idea about the nuclear power, because we connect the nuclear with radioactive catastrophes, with cancer, and from many, when we talk about bioenergy, we talk about the safety, the food safety. We are wondering if everything will be turned into bioenergy. And me, as a vice president of the Ipcc, I always look for a balance, and I don't like generalizations. So I really like your approach. From now on, she will be delivering her presentation in English. For those of you who are interested in that, I think that you have all realized this. We have a simultaneous translation system that you can feel free to use. And at the end of her presentation, we will have some time for the Q&A. If you don't mind, I think you've been given papers to make your questions, and I will pass them on to Thelma. We'll be moving here so that I can see the slides and I can speak better. The problem will be now to change into English. It's true that it's very complicated to change language. When I was younger, I could easily change from Portuguese to English to Spanish, but nowadays it's not so automatic.
Talk about global warming. What I'm going to do is basically talk just a little bit, very, very quickly, about a little bit more on the Ipcc, y particularmente lo que vamos a tener en el futuro muy próximo.
What we will be having in the very near future. This is the sixth cycle of the Ipcc. We call a cycle the time that that goes from the moment.
No te preocupes, puedes cambiar si quieres de uno a otro.
Entonces, me disculpe.
Apologies.
It is the time that it takes for us to finish the assessment reports. It normally takes 6 years, and then until you start another one. So a new cycle started in 2015, and we went in 2022. So we call this the sixth cycle of the Ipcc, the AR6, Assessment Report 6. And this has been possibly, or most certainly, the most ambitious cycle of the Ipcc. And why is that? Because not only we are going to have the assessment reports that are going to be produced by the 3 working groups that I mentioned before, the physical basis, impact, adaptation, vulnerability, and mitigation group. Their contributions is here. It's going to come in 2021, in different times in 2021. But before that, we have 3 special reports. The first one was the 1.5 global warming. And the 1.5 had a different nature, as I'm going to say. So 1.5 is already done. And 2 additional special reports are coming up this year. We have one really important one that is coming on climate change in land, that addresses issues like land degradation, desertification, food security. So it's going to be quite comprehensive. And we hope that the science was mature enough to provide us also some elements of the feasibility of us being able to do as much bioenergy as some of the models have assumed in some of the pathways. And another one is coming about the oceans. So it's ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And this also is relevant for the polar regions and the mountains regions. So we are going to have 2 reports that differ from the assessment reports, the big ones here, which build up from these ones, and provide the government already with some food for thought so they can act before we have 6 years until you have the assessment reports. So it's quite important, but it puts on the scientists who work voluntarily. All of us, we work voluntarily for the Ipcc. So put a lot of stress on them because several of them work for several of these products. So it's quite a huge amount of work. And more relevant than some of you might be interested, he's the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories that develops the methodologies. So now in May, next month, in Kyoto, we are going to have all the governments there in a session that accepts the methodologies or do not accept to provide changes that they see necessary in the assessment report, in the methodological report, but always respecting what the scientists say. The most difficult time we have in the approval sessions of the Ipcc that take normally 1 week is the fact that the language of the scientists not necessarily is comprehensible for the policymakers. And this is why sometimes also it is felt that some messages are not balancing the concerns of the developing countries and the developed countries. So there is a need to bring text from the big report into the summary for policymakers, which is basically 22 pages on average, that brings the most relevant points and findings, because we want the governments that are not going to read the whole thing, but the main points we want them to understand. So basically this is important. And then in 2022, when we finish up this cycle, is when we have the synthesis report. And the synthesis report is not a cut and glue, but has the responsibility to look at all the 7 products that have been produced before 2022 and make sense of it, make a narrative that then synthesizes the whole scientific findings between 2015 and 2022. So it's really beautiful what to do then. But here is really, really the most difficult part is here on the synthesis, because it takes really the ability of those that work on the synthesis to be able to integrate the knowledge that was in all the products. Very, very quickly, look how much Europeans we have now in the 6th cycle. Most of the participation of the authors, sorry for this, is 34% from Europe. So it's amazing to see that it superseded now the United States, who used to have the major contribution, in particular in the first assessment reports of the Ipcc. So it's a good balance, but it's nice to see also a little bit of that change that I was talking about. And here we see, for instance, a change from the previous assessment report in terms of the participation of females, from 21% to 33% for the whole work of the working groups. So we have 33% of females. And also a larger participation from developing countries, 44% against 37% in the last cycle. So this is really good, because bringing more developing countries helps us, not because we want them to be there, but it helps us to have more literature coming from developing countries. And this is really difficult to find most of the time. Most of the publications come from the developed world. And one of the difficulties that we had with the 1.5 was to see, is there enough literature also coming from the developing world, specifically for the 1.5, that would allow us to do a balanced report? That was one of the concerns. Fortunately, there was a lot there, and also, luckily, in the procedures of the Ipcc, we now allow also not only to have peer-reviewed literature that goes through all that process, but also allows, most importantly, to have reports from industries, for instance. That's interesting, because normally we don't know what is happening there because they don't publish scientifically. But they have so much relevance in terms of saying, how they are developing, say nuclear, for instance. How is all these reports that would bring a little bit more on the small reactors, on the new generation of reactors, 3, 4, what is coming up? And what are the challenges? So I think that this coming from the industries would really be helpful in the assessment report. And essentially, this is going to be important for the next assessment report of 2021. Because for mitigation, we have a specific chapter that addresses energy systems. So there, obviously, energy, nuclear, everything will come with a revived, depending on the literature that we have. Here, very quickly, is just the process that goes until we have the report finally approved. It starts with the government saying, yes, we want the scientists to produce. The government say that, not the scientists. So the government say, we want to have a special report on climate change and land. Okay, great. Agreed, agreed. So put together the scientists and ask them to tell us what they can tell that is novel, not the old things that we have seen in the previous report. So the scientists put together chapters, some outlines of these chapters, and after doing that, this is being brought to the governments. Governments sit down and say, well, very beautiful. It used to be more different in the past. Very nice, but they are not responding to what we want to see. So, understanding that the government, it's an intergovernmental panel. So the main users are the governments, not the sole, but the main users are the governments. So the government say, listen, but I want to have something else. So if you have science available, I would like to have this bullet point here saying this, I want to see this in the report. So the authors, after this outline is approved by the governments, it's when the whole thing starts and the drafts start, being produced. They start also to be reviewed during the production by expert reviewers, and in a more mature draft, it is done by expert reviewers and government reviewers, and all of them provide comments. And I'm going to show the impact of this in the 1.5 special report. So the process allows governments to be involved into this, allow their scientists to be engaged, allows to say you're being prescriptive, allows them to say you're missing some important literature here. So it's a process that I see Ipcc bridging with the policymakers in the best way that I find. How we talk the language, scientific language with the governments. And for that, there is another story. We are now bringing more communicators into the business, people that, have the skills to communicate. And it's very difficult also because scientists say that communicators normally banalize the science. So it's difficult to find a language that the scientist thinks is not banalized, and at the same time it's the, the language the governments want to see. Okay, let's move. Okay, so the whole thing, I think, the Paris Agreement 2015 came right after, the previous cycle ended in 2014 with the synthesis report. So all the scientific literature really brought food for thought for governments. And then they could agree unexpectedly, because people thought that, Paris Agreement would not be reached by the time it took for the Kyoto Protocol and the previous experiences. But, at the same time, much more flexibility was provided to governments, different from what we had previously in the Kyoto Protocol, where the governments from developed countries had to commit to reduce quantitative reductions that they agreed to do. And the developed countries didn't have these commitments, right? So on the other hand, the Paris Agreement brought everybody in, developed and developing countries, asking them to propose what they could do individually. Just indicate what you can do. Unfortunately, we see that pulling together all the contributions that countries brought in, unfortunately, we are far, far away from any pathway that brings us close to 1.2 to 2. We're close to something that leads us to 3 degrees Celsius or above at the end of the century. But as I say, there needs to be an increase in the ambition. Obviously, there is a need to increase the ambition. But this was a first trial. And every time, every country proposed what they could do, either under a condition, others without conditions. And when I say conditions, it's like financing, capacity building, technology transfer. So you have an amount that they would do voluntarily and domestically, and others that would require a little bit more of a push. So it was then interesting to see that the Paris Agreement finalized, regardless of the conditions under which it finalized, this flexibility, no quantitative emission reductions as we had before, more not necessarily all the countries doing all the sectors. They could pick the agriculture, the land, not economy-wise, as we say. So there was a lot of flexibility, but the Paris Agreement was there, and this is a real push for work. So basically, one of the aims of, there are several, but one of the aims to strengthen this global effort to, this global response to the global effort to deal with the threat of climate change was that of holding the increase in the temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius relative to the reference period that Ipcc assumed to be from 1850 to 1900, because we didn't have too much data before that. So for us, pre-industrial times is considered to be 1850, 1900, and it's where we take the average temperature, either only over land and now over oceans as well. So there are lots of things going on. So while pursuing then efforts to reach 1.5 above the pre-industrial levels at the end of this cycle. So the novel thing is not always that the climate change makes a request to the Ipcc. It does more from the methodological reports, not so much from special reports per se. But because the Ipcc in the previous cycle did not have in their low stabilization levels pathways, something that would lead us to 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees even. But we didn't have too much on 1.5 because the models were not mature enough. We didn't have enough literature. So anyway, because of this, the Climate Change Convention, the government, asked the Ipcc, which are basically the same governments, but in a different setting, political and scientific, to do this special report in 2018 that would address the impacts of global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, not only the impact of 1.5, but also how could we get to the end of the century limiting global warming to 1.5. And this is what we call pathways, as we are going to see. So just the challenge that we had was, lots of authors into this. We have also a category of contributing authors that do not come presentially to the meetings, but contribute sometimes a lot. And the whole report was based in 6,000 studies. And one of the most astonishing figures that we had was that during that review process that I mentioned, through expert reviews and government reviews, we had 42,000 comments on the draft, on the last draft of the report. And every one of these comments has to be addressed by the authors. Not only addressed, but they have to be in an Excel sheet saying, this has been taken into account, this has not because of this. So you have a follow-up process which is absolutely intense, but it's very transparent. And I think it provides a good means for us to improve and make the report more robust. So I'm going to then focus a little bit on the findings of the special report. We really changed communications, now brought this very bright figure, which is the background of one of the runs of how we would have different trajectories for 1.5. And this was the mitigation report from the last assessment report in 2014. But before that, we didn't have a special report in 2011, which was interesting. I like that one. although it's outdated now and has been updated now in this report, but continues to be of value. And it talks about renewable energy sources and climate change mitigation. And what was interesting was to see that nuclear was there. We're talking renewables, but nuclear is there. Fossil is there. Fossil with CCS, carbon capture and storage, is there. So it was interesting to see that despite the fact that we are talking about renewables, and we are going to see why is it there? Why is it there? Together with renewables, because renewables was the big thing. Okay, so where do we stand now? So just bringing, before we go into the transitions and why, so I'm trying to contextualize. So are you going to cut me off when I'm talking too much? No, because, I get really carried, away and, This is why they assigned me to be the communicator of the Ipcc, because I just love it. But, please do say, I'm going to try to be synthetic as much and have the questions. But where do we stand now? So today we say that the human activities have already caused what we say approximately, so it's not deterministic, 1 degree Celsius global warming since the pre-industrial times. And this is within an uncertainty range of 0.8 to 1.2. But you see that in many regions, not necessarily, sometimes people say, well, with the 1 degree, what does this mean? And we are going to see that one of the key messages of the IPCC is that every bit of warming matters. And we will see this when I talk about the impacts in possibly the next slide or so. But you see in some of the areas of the world, in the Arctic, for instance, you see that global warming there is approximately 3 times more than you have. So this is a global average, not necessarily distributed equally among the regions of the world. So some of the regions are more affected than others. And with this, we already see consequences of this global warming, be it an extreme weather, in the sea level rise, in the loss of the ice sheets in the Arctic. So we are seeing this happening already. There is one thing that I would like to say, that not necessarily all the events that we see happening are attributed to global warming. This is why you have the negationists, right? The deniers or the negationists, which are even worse. Not necessarily you say, well, this is because of climate change. No. There are some instances, and we expect it in the next cycle to be better able with the science to attribute certain types of events or occurrences to climate change and not to natural variability that is there. So you're just compounding in the events what is natural variability always happened, with annual variability. But if you take the average, if we are in a stationary climate, you would take the average and they would be the same always, despite the fact that annually you could have ups and downs, right? So in a stationary climate, you just would have that on average stable. And when you see climate change, you see that this trend changes not from 1 year to another. Normally, we take 30 years at a minimum to take this average and look. This is the difference between weather, and which is more associated to the climatic changes, and climate change per se, which is this average on long time and change in the trend of the weather, of the mean weather. So obviously, as I say, we are already seeing these consequences. Unfortunately, these consequences affect much more the poor people, the most vulnerable ones. So when we think about, bringing justice, and I think I missed one of the slides, that when IPCC said, yes, we are going to accept the invitation from the Climate Change Convention, we will do impacts, we will do pathways, but we want it, this coming from governments, we want to do it under or in the context of sustainable development, eradication of poverty, and reducing inequalities. So you are bringing here from governments components, social components, that really require the Ipcc to bring many more social scientists into the drafting and into the writing of this special report on 1.5. And this is why you see one of the chapters, which is the 5th chapter, devoted to sustainable development. And I think that the most interesting message that we see from there is basically that when we are talking about the portfolios that I'm going to tell that are necessary that we put together in terms of mitigation, there are different ways that you can put it together. But there is ways in which you can bring together the sustainable development. And that one of the messages of the Ipcc was that, addressing climate change or limiting global warming to 1.5 goes hand in hand in achieving other policy goals, such as the sustainable development goals of the Agenda 2030. So we are looking now in a way that is much more holistically. And with the portfolio of mitigation actions can have different effects, different impacts on the way this is going to impact people, ecosystems. So there is not one single way. There are several ways we can do it, but with different implications for people as well. So there are some mitigation. Is always mitigation good? It's always positive. There are synergies. There are synergies between addressing some of the actions that you do for mitigation. There are synergies with also addressing some of the SDGs like health, energy, industry. There are several synergies, but are also some trade-offs. Like one clear trade-off is the potentially necessary expansion of bioenergy and potential impact on food security. So you see that there might be this trade-off between, reaching the 1.5 and how does that impact people on their everyday life, not only in terms of food security, but the way they will have to work, some workers being displaced because coal mines possibly will disappear. And what do you do with those workers? Because they don't know how to do other things, especially in developing countries. So we are not talking about justice, equity. We are bringing a language that we didn't put so much emphasis on before. So doing ways, and this is why we say this transformation that we need to have. But anyway, if we do the current rate that we see in terms of global warming is basically 0.2 degrees Celsius every 10 years. So if we go at this pace, we would have reached 1.5 around 2030, 2050. There was one concern when this work started, that past emissions could have already committed global warming to 1.5, because you have these effects, aggregating, right? So it's not immediate that you see the impacts, and this is why sea level rise will rise regardless of us stopping everything. It's going to continue to rise, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. But anyway, so what was then concluded was that these past emissions did not commit the 1.5 or above. So one of the key messages of the Ipcc is that limiting global warming to 1.5 is not impossible. I would prefer that we would say is possible, but they said is not impossible. But it will require unprecedented changes in all aspects of the society. Society means also sectors and everything, right? Unprecedented. It's not impossible. It was another message. So there is. So it was identified that there is a window of action to limit the global warming to 1.5 at the end of this century, and this will require substantial reductions of greenhouse gases. The most important one being CO2, as we are going to see. So, mitigation actions, or meaning actions to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. But not only that, you can have mitigation actions to enhance removing CO2 from the atmosphere. For instance, one example is bioenergy is one example, also with CCS, carbon capture and storage. large-scale reforestation, all this contributed for want to reduce, and we are going to see the role of this with time. So this is some of the impacts. I thought that I had this different slide here, but sorry for this. That brought not only the Mediterranean, but it also brought in Southern Europe. This work on the potential impacts of 1.5 that you see in different colors here. So where you see here green, it's 1.5. Where you see global warming between 1.5 and 2, it's seen in brown, and in red you see 2 degrees Celsius. We are comparing the impacts. I'm gonna do for the southern Europe, there is a lot there in terms of drought. Obviously, the risk of droughts increase moving from 1.5 to 2 and above. And you see here the language that they are using. So the impact is much more in terms of the dryness due to the drought, and not only the dryness, but also droughts in continuous successive years. So in the Mediterranean, you already see this attributed to human activities and to the 1 degree Celsius that we have already in the global warming. So also precipitation, water deficits are some of the projections that we have for Southern Europe. But every single country will have different impacts. Basically, we try to improve, we try to catalyze the modeling community so that they would develop regional models that would be able to capture better the regional impacts more than the global. And I think that at every new assessment, we are improving on this. So great. So it's nice to know that being in a world of 1.5 is going to be very different from a world of 2 degrees. So this was one of the messages of the Ipcc also. And that we didn't know it was going to be so clear. And that every half degree, in the case of the assessment that was done, would have such a significant impact in terms of the risks, particularly in terms of droughts and heavy precipitation events and so on. So every bit of warming was the message that the Ipcc conveyed matters. So great. So if we know that we are going to have a substantial difference in terms of impacts or in how the world will be at 1.5 and 2, what we need to do to achieve this 1.5, and that's where we now start looking at where do we go from here. So one of the things is that the knowledge of the climate system response led the literature points that the CO2 emissions have to be net zero. I will explain net zero. Net zero by mid-century. We are talking about 2040, 2050, around 2050, right? It doesn't mean that we have only 12 years. I think that the press, the media understood it differently. We don't have only 12 years because we are going to see the different pathways, but we have different implications for what happens if we don't achieve this in the different ways we will achieve this zeroing CO2 emissions by mid-century. And with the other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, we don't project that they have to reach zero because they will not. But we project that simultaneously they're forcing in the global warming has to decline simultaneously with the CO2 emissions. So in doing then with this understanding that we have to get, let's say, zero emissions, net emissions mean not only the emissions, but the removals. So it's the balance between emissions and removals. So understanding that this balance needs to be zero by 2050, the Ipcc then assessed all the sectors that could contribute to this. And obviously, the energy sector, which is one of the most significant sectors that contribute to to climate change in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases was one of them very significantly. And also we have land and ecosystems, we have infrastructure, we are talking about buildings, we are talking about transport. So we are talking about the whole range, including also the industry. So we have what we talk about energy system transitions, industry system transitions, land system transitions. So, the 1.5 talks about transitions in all these areas. And what would be necessary, what kind of transformations would be necessary for these to lead us to have, in aggregate, collectively, a 1.5 at the very end. So some examples would be to shift to low, this is important, to low or zero emission power generation, such as renewables, nuclear, or fossil with CCS, electrifying the transport and industry, improving energy efficiency. These were some of the examples. Most importantly of all, decarbonizing or decarbonization, which is reducing the carbon intensity of the electricity generation. So the AR5, the previous assessment report already indicated that decarbonization would be one of the key components in achieving low stabilization levels. At that time, the low stabilization level was something near 2 degrees Celsius, not the 1 degree. But it's interesting also to see that qualitatively, talking about measures or actions at 1.5, will not be too different from 2. So qualitatively speaking, what's necessary? So the examples I'm giving, valid for 1.5, valid for 2, so where is the difference? The difference is on the timing. The timing of this, so large scale and rapid. So this is what is impressive about the 1.5, and this is what is the challenge and what scares everyone. So in the AR5, the last assessment report, it contemplated renewables, nuclear, and CCS to increase from the 30% share in 2012, 2013, to be more than 80% in 2050. And fossil fuel power generation without CCS would be completely phased out. And this is where it starts to become now interesting. What did this shows? The runs, this is the end of the century. So this is the run of 89 different models that have different assumptions, all of them leading to 1.5. So there is not a single pathway that will lead us to be limiting global warming to 1.5. But the implications that we have from choosing these different pathways, as I'm going to show in the next slide, is really impressive as well, right? So from these 89 potential, let me go back, potential ways that we can reach that, and we say, we can reach with no or limited overshoot, I'm going to explain, or with high overshoot. So what is overshoot? Overshoot is a pathway that would lead at the end of the century to 1.5. But before it reaches there, it goes above. So you go above the 1.5 before you are there, and then you have to bring it down to be 1.5. And that is what really makes the whole difference on the choice of the pathway we will choose. And so there is something that I will have to read because I'm not going to be able to, it's here. So we chose here 4 pathways from these envelope of potential pathways that leads to limiting global warming to 1.5. And these 4 are reflected in these figures here. Regardless of the pathway, CO2 emissions would have to be near zero, net zero, by 2050. So in any one of those trajectories, it has to be net zero. So if you look here on 1.5, and this is 1.5 is one of the pathways, and what are the assumptions for that pathway? So pathway P1 is a scenario in which social, business, and technological innovations result in lower energy demand up to 2050, while living standards rise. So you're talking about, in the global south, having better standards of life. Downsized energy system enables rapid decarbonization of energy supply. And you see here that in this, when I'm doing the breakdown of the contributions of fossil, which are really in gray here, going downward until the end of the century. And to reach that, I have to use a little bit of afforestation, but I do not use bioenergy, for instance, with or without carbon capture and storage. So it's a pathway that decarbonizes rapidly, goes smooth. Possibly we call it sustainability pathway. And whereas if we go to P4, you see that what you see there in yellow, which is the contribution of the breakdown with BECCS or bioenergy with CCS, and afforestation, and afforestation on a large scale is shown. So what is P4? P4 is a resource and energy intensive scenario in which economic growth and globalization lead to widespread adoption of greenhouse gas intensive lifestyles, including high demand for transportation fuels and livestock products. Emission reductions in this kind of pathway will happen mainly through technological means, making strong use of bioenergy with carbon storage and carbon capture and storage. So what I want to say here is that the portfolio, the pathway that we want to choose, might have very impacting effects. Maybe the next slide shows here. When we are talking about making use of the carbon dioxide removal, it means, okay, so we were not able to zero the CO2 emissions. So what do? We have to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And how are you going to do this? Well, we are going to do what they say about these carbon dioxide removal techniques or measures or actions, as they say, that BECCS is one of them, large-scale afforestation is another, but you also have ocean fertilization. You have also direct air CO2 capture with an extremely high cost, but one that is not CDR, but people also talk about another geoengineering. It used to call geoengineering, now it's changing. We decided to split. CDR is one part, but another way that you would reduce, it would reduce the energy that reaches the land. And this would be basically what we call solar radiation modification. So in a certain way, you impede the energy from the sun from reaching the terrestrial system so that it doesn't warm more than it should, so you block. Normally, you have the normal aerosols, like volcanoes, for instance, when you have eruptions, you have aerosols. In these aerosols, normally what they do, they don't warm, they cool the earth, sometimes for months or sometimes for years, because they have particles of aerosols that block some of the energy coming from the sun and brings them back to the high atmosphere. So we see here that CDR in large scale, say bioenergy in large scale, afforestation, reforestation large scale, all of these, we don't know scientifically what could be the impacts of that in biodiversity, in food, in water. It's still not mature enough for us because we didn't know about these potential models that would require so much if we are not able to do so much in terms of energy reduction. But some of these measures might be, like restoration of natural ecosystems, carbon sequestration. This could be helpful to improve soil quality, food security, and so on. But let's move quickly here. So transitions that are consistent with the 1.5 between 2020 in terms of energy supply. Primary energy in oil declined substantially in between, depends on the model. minus 32% to minus 74%. The deployment of also carbon capture and storage varies enormously. Primary energy would be supplied by bioenergy as per the models that have been run, ranging from 40 to 310 exajoules per year. And just for comparison's sake, some of the models consider that nuclear could be as low as 3 to 120. And this depends very much on what the models assume in terms of the technological developments that you may have. So the narratives that are used to construct those pathways have assumptions that vary a lot in terms of how much the technologies would have evolved. And these would have implications, not only technologies as we'll see, but technology is one of them that could explain the differences that you see here in the range of participation from nuclear and also from bioenergy. So obviously, to do the system transitions, energy system transitions, we have a range of technologies and behavior changes, as I have mentioned. Renewable supply for the electricity in 2050, basically 70 to 85, we are talking global. So we are talking about a huge investment on renewables. Coal declines steeply, getting to almost zero in 2050, and you ask China how they're going to do it. We have been in a meeting together, but China, what you're going to do is this, But anyway, they tried to respond. But you would have to have deep emission in transport, in buildings, transitions in the regional land use, but depends very much on the mitigation portfolio that is put together. So when we look at all those 89 pathways that I showed in that envelope, most of them contemplates nuclear. Very few don't. But because there are very large and significant differences in the contribution of nuclear in these models. And one of the reasons for that is possibly the assumptions that you make to have, or the narrative for the construction of that, those pathways. And in particular, the uncertainties that we have concern the future deployment of nuclear, and in particular being constrained by preferences, by social preferences. And this is one of the things that we are going to see at the end, one of my latest slides, and I'm coming to a close very soon. But we are going to talk about feasibility barriers. So all the models that contemplate the nuclear, they contemplate the nuclear in their narratives, including the mature existing nuclear plants, but they are also including the new generation or the new options that we are going to have for nuclear, including the generation 3, 4 for the reactors, new fuel cycles for uranium and thorium, small reactors, cogeneration. So you have a new lot of changes or research that is being carried out in the nuclear world that might make the enormous difference in terms of social acceptability. And this could facilitate the inclusion of the nuclear within the portfolio of mitigation options that the countries will have to do. So as I said, some of the pathways do not see any role, and basically this is because of, mainly because of institution impediments, the regulations that the countries do not have in place. But others, as I said, most of them do see an incredible role. This is just very quickly, this is the result from different models. As I said, the inclusion of nuclear together with renewables and fossil. This is 2030, 2050, and 2100. For nuclear is here in brown. So you see that different models do different assumptions, and the contribution of nuclear varies among them, as does what we expect to have in terms of the primary energy demand that we are having by 2100. But you see the different models, how they completely behave differently because of the assumptions that they are made on how the future will progress, development of the population growth, economic growth, and so on. We see here also, here, sorry for this, but this is one of the figures that we have. So this is one of the assumptions that have been made in the pathways P1, P2, P3, P4. Not only with biomass, fossil with CCS, but you see here from nuclear in 2030 and in 2050 relative to 2010, and these are percentages of the increases or decreases in terms of the nuclear use, in these different pathways, as I showed before. So all these assumptions can be assessed. If anyone has interest, we can provide, the link to where all these data has been included. So already we saw in the last assessment report that the nuclear energy could make an increasing contribution to low carbon energy supply. And the barriers that have been identified are multifold. Operational risks, uranium mining risks, financial and regulatory risks, unresolved waste management issues, nuclear weapon proliferation concerns, and adverse public opinion. So there are several barriers that need to be overcome, I would say, to make nuclear to be, to have less of resistance. Addressing this and saying that this is being done differently, especially in the new generation that has smaller waste, generating a smaller waste or generation, or improving the way you are doing this, the use of the energy might make an enormous difference in the way the public opinion will see nuclear being embedded more largely into their mitigation portfolio. Everybody knows about this because you're coming from but nuclear energy had a much higher percentage in 1993 than it has today. 17% in 1993, 11% in 2012. This was even before the Fukushima accident. You have this diminishing trend in terms of nuclear, the nuclear contribution, the nuclear share in the primary energy supply. And basically where this is happening is basically in Asia, a lot in China, in Russia as well, and the top 5 countries, and this comes from the previous reports, United States, France, Japan, Russia, and Republic of Korea, together representing 68% of the global nuclear capacity in 2013. I don't think that this has changed too much. But I almost coming to an end. I think I have 2 more slides to go. I like this one very much. Because when we are talking about nuclear, if you ask the normal people, they will normally say to you that nuclear has lots of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a myth. Because if you look here we are putting together life cycle. So looking here from all the process of generating the energy from nuclear relative to renewables. So you have bioenergy here, photovoltaics here, you have solar power here, geothermal here, hydropower here, ocean energy here, and you have nuclear energy here, wind energy here. So in blue, you see the CO2 emissions from all these sources. And you see the nuclear is even sometimes with less life cycle emissions than you have for some of the renewables. And what you see here are the traditional oil, coal, and then what you see in red here is with these technologies being used with CCS in red. And you see that even with CCS, for these, the nuclear has a better, in terms of less emissions than you would have. So I think that this is a very important slide that really motivates people to look at nuclear from a different point of view. So if we can convince that, yes, it contributes to that portfolio of getting to net zero in 2050, it can have a huge contribution. Similar to what? Bioenergy, wind, aeolic, everything, right? And you don't have direct CO2 emissions from nuclear. And this is the key. Now, I like this also because the Ipcc looks at the feasibility of some of the mitigation options. And here I have picked only the renewables and the nuclear and the power with CCS. So you see here what kinds of barriers you could have. You could have several. You could have economic, you could have technological, you could have institutional, social and cultural, environmental, and geophysical. So this is the barriers that we see when we are addressing each one of these: wind, solar, bioenergy, power sector with CCS, nuclear. And when you see this color being darker is where you have no barriers. So feasibility for that specifically condition here doesn't have for the nuclear. And when you see this shading here, it's because there is no positive nor negative effect. So it could be okay in some places, not so much in others. And but you see here that basically in this generalized assessment, we see that the main barriers for the nuclear regards the social culture acceptability or feasibility, or how public see the nuclear being inserted, and also institutional, which would mean to have the regulatory regulations in place, rules, and so on. So concluding, nuclear powers have low life cycle emissions, low operation costs, but have very high upfront investment flows. And also significant technical, market, and regulatory risks. So the message that Ipcc does, it's not a recommendation, but it's the message that it does, is basically that without the support of governments, investments in new nuclear plants, currently not economically attractive, and in particular, because of the very low costs that you have, for instance, for coal, for gas. So in terms of competition, if we are to talk, we have this, and there would need to be a very large investment from governments so that public and private, developments for the new plants would potentially be necessary to really enlarge the participation of nuclear. So this brings a little bit of the picture, mostly positive, I would say. But you see that there are so significant differences and so many barriers to overcome, but doable, especially because of all the research that is happening ongoing that would improve in terms of safety, that could change completely the social acceptability of nuclear power plants. Okay, that's it.